Hello and welcome. This is the Fair Housing Overview, and I'm Kara Brodpure, Senior Counsel at the California Civil Rights Department. All right, I'm going to do my boring lawyerly disclaimer here. This is for informational purposes only. I'm not going to be giving you legal advice in this training. We're not making policies. And this information is recent as of today, but things can always change, especially when it comes to the law tomorrow or in the future. Let's go over our agenda. First, I'm going to briefly talk about the California Civil Rights Department. Then I'm going to talk about fair housing laws in California. And I'm going to spend most of my presentation going over some of the specific protected characteristics that we get the most questions about. And then I'm going to give you a list of resources. So let's talk a bit about the California Civil Rights Department. We have a big job because our mission is to protect the people of California from discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. We also enforce laws prohibiting hate violence and human trafficking. Let's talk about some of the things that the Civil Rights Department does. What we're mostly known for is to take and investigate complaints of discrimination and other civil rights violations. When we have complaints, after we investigate them, sometimes we will help people come to resolutions. We do dispute resolution or mediations to try and work these issues out. Sometimes we go to court to enforce civil rights laws. We also have a Civil Rights Council, and their job is to make regulations to give a little bit more guidance and information to folks regarding the civil rights laws that we enforce. We collect data on the pay and demographics of large employers' workforces. We do outreach and education, which I'm obviously doing right now. And we work with communities and state and local governments, bodies to constructively manage and resolve discrimination-based conflict. The Civil Rights Department can provide reasonable accommodations to anyone who needs help accessing our services and information, including filing a complaint with us. Here's the information to request an accommodation if you're a person with disabilities and you need an accommodation to access our services. Also, if you need to access CRD services in a language other than English, we can provide translation services of almost any language. And here's the information in order to request bilingual services. So what do I mean by fair housing? In a nutshell, fair housing is really just the right to choose where you want to live and to make that choice free from discrimination. And when I do this training live, I often will ask people to put some ideas in the chat about why fair housing is an important issue. And some of the things I hear are that people want to choose the community they live in, they want to live close to family and friends, they want to be close to grocery stores and businesses that they like to frequent, close to churches, to schools, to public transportation, to parks. Sometimes people point out that there are many studies that show that where you live and the community you grow up in can really make a difference as to your opportunities in the future. So housing choice is incredibly important, and that is why we are talking to you today about your fair housing rights. Now I'm going to be showing a clip from a documentary called A Matter of Place. This documentary was made by the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York, and it really sets the stage for what we mean by housing discrimination and really goes into how housing discrimination tends to play out now. Usually it's not very overt or obvious. People aren't usually saying, hey, I'm discriminating against you because you're a person of color, you have a disability. It's usually a little more underhanded than that, treating people differently, just kind of doing it, a little, covertly. And so I think it really helps to set the stage for the rest of this presentation and the examples and protected characteristics I'm going to talk about.
Apartment up on the top floor by the super of the building. We were looking around, you poking around as you do look in the closets and this and oh, this looks nice. And yeah, okay, I got to get my wife to come and see this. And we went over and looked out the window a little bit, and he looked around and he said, listen, I've been doing this for 30 years in this building. I've never let one black person live here yet.
Housing discrimination is very prevalent in American life, and one of the ways we know that is through studies that are conducted by private fair housing groups, that there really is pervasive discrimination in terms of rental housing, in terms of people who are trying to buy homes. They may do it in a very friendly way. They may direct you to a different kind of housing opportunity. They may say, oh, I suddenly have nothing available.
Looking for an apartment in New York City is like Navy SEAL training. I mean, it's pretty intense. You're gonna go through a lot of apartments, looking for apartments on Craigslist, looking through brokers. It can be quite challenging.
Constantly running around to all different corners of the city, and then also presenting your credentials. Our financial situation was good, that our credit was good, we both had good jobs, we both have good backgrounds. There was nothing that we could think of that would disqualify us from getting the best apartment that we could afford. We both had really sort of clear criteria as far as what we wanted in terms of apartments. I wanted something that was spacious and sunny and lots of light and whatever. We wanted enough room for ourselves to be comfortable, nice neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, we found this one in Park Slope, and it seemed ideal. From the description, from the pictures. There was a big snowstorm in progress. It was just beginning on Saturday. And there were not a lot of people who called Andrea, who lived there, to make appointments to see the apartment. So we got there first. We were the first ones who saw it. Apparently, we were the only ones who saw it because the other couple that was scheduled to come by never did make it because of the storm. It was beautiful. When we saw it, it was exactly what we were looking for. It was spacious and sunny, and the apartment itself was in good condition. The building was in good condition. The neighborhood was great. It was ideal.
Immediately, Steve phoned the real estate broker to rent the apartment.
We had a pretty good exchange. She gave me a list of items that I would need to bring in order to begin the application process. She faxed over the material. She goes, it sounds like you guys are good and qualified candidates. I told her our credit score was excellent. She was excited on the phone. I told her that the next morning I'd be there bright and early. She said, okay, great, we'll see you tomorrow morning. Wednesday, I go to the realty office and I asked the receptionist, is Roseanne available? Roseanne heard me. She stood up and said, hello, can I help you? And I began the process of giving her all of my paperwork. As I'm giving her my IDs to make a copy for my wife and I, the receptionist turns and says, the copier's broken. At the time, Roseanne had a peculiar look on her face, as though that's news to her.
Steve went to a nearby shop to get the copies himself.
I come back, I give her a photocopy of our IDs, and I start to pull out money in order to pay for the application fee. And she's told me that I'm not gonna take your money. And I was like, why not? And she said that there are other applications ahead of yours, so if we get to yours, we'll contact you. And I was just shocked and stunned. I was of the impression that I was a very different circumstance.
This is this common phrase that people talk about in fair housing, that real estate brokers or landlords, they discriminate with a handshake and a smile. It's actually done often in a sort of congenial way, as if what we should expect is that you want to live over there with other minorities and not in this neighborhood. We have nothing for you here.
It just seemed incredible to us that in this day and age in New York City, that someone would decide that we weren't qualified to live there because of our race.
What is a protected characteristic? Basically, they're things about a person or a group of people that are protected by the law from discrimination. An easy example is that the law protects people from race discrimination, so race is a protected characteristic. Now I'm going to give you a list and overview of the civil rights laws in California that protect people from housing discrimination. The big one is the Fair Employment and Housing Act. This protects people from discrimination in housing and also from harassment in housing based on protected characteristics. There's other additional protections that I'm going to talk about soon. And also the Unruh Civil Rights Act. This protects people from discrimination and harassment by businesses, and this includes housing accommodations. We also have the Disabled Persons Act. This is a California law that gives people with disabilities the same right to the general public to the use of all public places. And we also have Government Code 11135. Basically, this law says that you can't discriminate against people if you're taking money from the state, including in housing. And here's a list of protected characteristics in California. California has many more protected characteristics than those in the federal laws that cover the entire country, but we do have all of the same ones that cover the entire country. And in addition, we have many others, including sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. We also have protections for source of income discrimination, and that includes the use of a Section 8 voucher, primary language, immigration status, citizenship, familial status, disability, and these can be actual protected characteristics that apply to you. It could be, someone perceives that you have a protected characteristic. Maybe they think that you have a disability and you don't. You're still protected. Or you could be associated with a person with a protected characteristic. For example, you're a parent of a child that is disabled. Are the additional protections I was talking about. They come from the Fair Employment and Housing Act, and they're not specific protected characteristics, but they come from the law. The first is the right to be free from discrimination and harassment based on protected characteristics. Also, there is a right to operate a licensed childcare in a provider's home, and there are specific protections for people with criminal histories that are looking for housing. Who has to follow fair housing laws? This list is actually much longer than I think a lot of people realize. There are definitely landlords and people that sell homes, but also housing authorities that administer the Section 8 program and other federally subsidized housing, homeowners associations, real estate agents, builders, mortgage lenders, people who appraise housing, even providers of housing related services, so things like water, sewer, and electricity, and there's many more. So we're going to start with source of income discrimination. This is a specific protected characteristic from California. Housing providers are not allowed to discriminate against people in California based on how they're going to pay their rent. So this is the source of the income, not the amount or the level of income. This includes sources of income include any funds that are paid directly to a tenant, including things like public benefits, SSI, SSDI, or funds that are paid to a housing owner or landlord on behalf of a tenant, like a Section 8 voucher or other types of rental assistance. And let's do a hypothetical to talk about source of income discrimination. This is Bashir. Bashir has a Section 8 voucher and applies to rent a unit from Ariel. Ariel looks over Bashir's application and says he can have the apartment. And the next day, Bashir gives Ariel paperwork from the housing authority to fill out for his Section 8 voucher. Ariel gets annoyed and tells Bashir she has no problem with him using a Section 8 voucher, but she is not filling out the paperwork. Did Ariel violate fair housing law? And the answer is yes. So let's talk about it. Source of income discrimination can include refusing to fill out paperwork or give documents that are necessary for people to use rental assistance and other sources of income. Because if you refuse to do those things, you're effectively making it impossible to use that rental assistance. Also, any advertisements that say no Section 8, things like no public assistance, no vouchers. Also, if an advertisement shows a preference for certain types of people, like they say, you must have 6 months of employment, that is discriminatory because it has a preference for people who receive income from employment, but there are people, as I talked about before, that get income from other places, like rental assistance, public benefits, retirement benefits. Also, refusing to renew a Section 8 lease or evicting a tenant because they received a Section 8 voucher and plan on using it going forward. There's also a new protection for people who have rental assistance, such as a Section 8 voucher. As of January 1st of 2024, housing providers have to give applicants with rental subsidies like Section 8 the opportunity to provide verifiable and lawful evidence of their ability to cover the rent before running a credit check. With what this really means is that, people who have rental assistance have a right to show that they can pay the rent without having their credit history considered. If somebody provides this type of evidence, the housing provider must consider this instead of an applicant's credit history. Some examples of evidence that could be provided by an applicant are things like bank statements, pay stubs, statements of public benefits that show your ability to pay the rent. CRD also has a fair housing testing program. What this is that we contract with a nonprofit in the Los Angeles area, and they send people to test properties for housing discrimination, either in person or over the phone. They'll have one person that has a protected characteristic. For example, they have a Section 8 voucher, and one person that doesn't, and they try to see if the people are treated differently. We are conducting fair housing testing right now, and since 2020, the nonprofit that we've been contracting with are called the Housing Rights Center. They've done hundreds of tests of source of income discrimination, specifically Section 8 vouchers, and almost half of these tests have shown evidence of discrimination. So about 50% of tests that they have done have shown people being discriminated against in some way because they're using a Section 8 voucher. They've also done race discrimination tests, and about 25% of those have also come back positive for racial discrimination. All right, let's talk about our next protected characteristic: immigration status discrimination, national origin discrimination, and discrimination based on ethnicity. What we mean by national origin is the place where someone was born. Ethnicity in California is defined by the culture of somebody, sometimes a geographic area, customs, language, also immigration status, whether someone is documented or not, or maybe they're a lawful permanent resident, or they're here on a specific type of visa. So discrimination based on those factors is unlawful in California. An example would be a landlord threatening to call immigration authorities on an undocumented tenant if they don't agree to move out, or charging a higher deposit to someone who is not originally from the United States. Another example is refusing to let somebody purchase a condo because they're not a US citizen, or one that we see quite a bit, requiring a social security number or a social security card to rent a home. That's not a legal requirement in California. CRD recently settled a case where the complainants were a married couple and their two children, and their housing provider thought they were undocumented and wanted to discriminate against them and said they were going to call immigration if they didn't move out within a matter of days. And the landlord also threatened to do a number of other things. And there was a settlement of $250,000, and the housing provider was also required to attend training and make anti-discrimination policies. So engaging in national origin, ethnicity, and immigration status discrimination can be very expensive and can really harm families and communities and people. So that's why it's unlawful in California. So let's do another hypo. This is Rabia. Rabia is a single mom who lives in an apartment complex with her two kids, aged 4 and 6. The apartment complex has a pool, and Rabia has been informed by management that children are only permitted to use the pool Monday to Friday from 9 to 3. And if you have kids, you know that this is a time kids are usually at school or daycare. She asked for permission to allow her kids to use the pool on the weekend, and she's told that the rules can't be changed just to accommodate her kids. Is the complex violating fair housing laws? And the answer is yes, and let's talk about it. So the Rabia example is an example of familial status discrimination. And in California, housing providers can't exclude families with children. The only exception is there are certain types of senior housing that have age restrictions, but with the exception of those types of housing, housing providers can't exclude families with children. This includes statements that discourage families from moving in, like saying, oh, there's really no place to play here. This is not really a kid-friendly building, or other examples of familial status discrimination, if a single mom is renting a one bedroom with her kids, requiring them to rent a larger unit, or requiring someone to rent a larger unit because of pregnancy or the decision to adopt or get custody of a child. Also, overly restrictive rules or statements like Rabia's that discourage families from enjoying all parts of their premises. Things like children in common areas must be supervised at all times, no bikes or skateboarding in common areas, only adults in the laundry room. And CRD actually settled a case recently where a large housing provider prohibited outdoor play and required supervision of all kids under the age of 14. And this actually resulted in a $3 million settlement and the housing provider being required to change their policies and attend training. All right, our next protected characteristic that we're going to focus on is disability or disability discrimination. Disability discrimination is prohibited, and it includes refusing to rent somebody because they have a mental health disability, charging a higher deposit to somebody because they're in a wheelchair and maybe you're worried they're going to do damage, refusing to rent to someone because they receive disability benefits. This is also a source of income discrimination, and refusing to grant a reasonable accommodation or modification. All right, so let's do a hypothetical. This is Luis. He rents an apartment with his partner and two kids. Luis is disabled, and his main source of income is his disability benefits, and they're deposited into his account on the 5th of every month. Unfortunately, his complex has a rule that any rent payment made after the 3rd of the month will be charged a late fee. And as a result, Luis has accumulated over $400 in late fees. And it's putting his housing in jeopardy because the housing provider is saying, hey, you need to pay me back for all these late fees. Luis requests a reasonable accommodation to be permitted to pay his rent on the 6th of each month. His landlord refuses, stating that everyone will start paying rent late if he starts letting Luis do it, and that paying rent late has nothing to do with having a disability. Did the landlord violate fair housing law? And the answer is yes. Let's talk about why the housing provider in the Luis hypo violated fair housing law. So Luis requested to pay his rent later in the month because of the receipt of his disability benefits, and that is an example of a reasonable accommodation. Luis is receiving those benefits because he has a disability, and his ability to pay the rent is affected by him receiving the disability benefits on a later date. So that would be an example of a reasonable accommodation. Accommodations generally are just, they're changes in rules, policies, practices to assist someone with a disability from having equal use of a dwelling. So in Luis's case, he was not going to be able to continue living in that apartment if he kept accumulating all of those late fees. The accommodation was necessary to keep him in his housing, and the reason that he needed the accommodation is related to his disability. So that would be considered to be a reasonable accommodation. Other examples are emotional support animals. I'm not talking about assistance animals, just emotional support animals. So animals that help people manage the symptoms of their disabilities. more time to meet deadlines or comply with notices. Say, you get a notice from your landlord saying, hey, you got to remove all this stuff from your front yard, and you have a physical disability that might make it hard to get that done. You can ask for more time to get it done. More time to move out. Say your disability is impacting your ability to find new housing or to get out of housing. You could ask for more time to move. Allowing a live-in aide or someone to move in with you to help take care of you. That's an accommodation. A closer parking space. Also, I talked about this with Luis, but, economic accommodations, waiver of late fees, adjusting the date rent is due, letting people have a cosigner. So, sometimes people with disabilities, may not have requisite credit, although I did talk about that law before. That's changing that a little bit, but allowing someone to co-sign saying they would also be responsible for the rent when a housing provider usually doesn't do that. Allowing someone to break the lease. Say there's a disability related reason why, the housing's not working for them and they need to move. It can really be anything as long as the person requesting the accommodation can show that it is necessary because of a disability. All right, here's another hypothetical. This is Hannah and her adorable dog. And Hannah applies for a vacancy with landlord Carol and notifies Carol she'll be bringing an emotional support animal. Carol responds that she wants proof that Hannah's dog is a real emotional support animal. Carol tells Hannah that she needs a certificate or registration for Hannah's emotional support animal before she can have it in the apartment. Can landlord Carol do this? And the answer is no. So when it comes to emotional support animals, unlike assistance or service animals, emotional support animals don't have to be trained to do a specific task. They are animals that help people with disabilities to manage the symptoms of their disabilities. For example, many people with mental health disabilities who may have anxiety or depression sometimes find it hard to keep a schedule or to get out of the house. So they might get a dog, so they leave the house and get out in the community and walk the dog, and that helps them manage their symptoms. There are no registration requirements for emotional support animals. There's no official emotional support animal registry. Websites that say that they're going to register your emotional support animal are scams, essentially. That is not required. It's not something that is regulated at all by the state of California. Emotional support animals just have to be an animal that helps somebody with a disability manage the symptoms of their disability. So in contrast to reasonable accommodations, which are a change to a rule or policy, modifications are physical changes to a unit or the common areas associated with a unit to allow someone with a disability equal access to housing. Some examples of reasonable modifications include everything from installing a grab bar in a bathroom to widening doorways for people in wheelchairs, lowering kitchen cabinets, adding a ramp to the primary entrance so it's accessible to people in wheelchairs, installing a blinking doorbell or emergency alarm to provide alerts to someone who is deaf, or putting up braille signage for someone who is blind. The laws regarding who has to pay for reasonable modifications are very complicated. What you should know generally is that usually it is the tenant that is responsible to pay for a modification. There are some exceptions, including if you live in housing that is subsidized by the federal government, not Section 8 vouchers, or certain types of housing, and housing that may be subsidized by other types of governments, like a state government or a local government. They may be required to pay for a modification. There's also other exceptions as well, and we can't get into all of them right now. But the main thing to know is that it's usually the tenant's responsibility to pay for the modification. All right, let's do another hypothetical. This is James. James applies to live in an apartment, and after receiving his application, the housing provider runs a criminal history check. The criminal check states that James has been arrested several times for assault. The housing provider denies his application. Was this a lawful denial? And the answer is no, and let's talk about it. So let's talk about why what the housing provider did in James's example was unlawful. Generally, housing providers are allowed to check criminal history of applicants, but there are certain types of criminal history information that they are not allowed to consider. One, and the main one in this hypothetical, is arrests that did not lead to a conviction. So this is when someone's maybe apprehended by the police and they think they may have been involved in a crime, but they're never charged and, convicted of doing that crime. And the reason for this not being considered is an arrest by itself is not proof of somebody doing something wrong or committing a crime. It's just the suspicion of that. Also, some other criminal history information that cannot be considered includes records that are sealed or expunged, or records that are not supposed to be on someone's criminal history. I will say criminal history records often have mistakes, including things that are not supposed to be there. So even if it's there and you see it, if you're not supposed to consider it, you should consider it. Also, matters that are processed in the juvenile justice system. Housing providers are also prohibited from having what we call blanket bans on all people with criminal histories, saying things like no felonies or, providing exceptions or exclusions for people who have certain types of criminal histories. This is because if you deny somebody in California based on a conviction that they have in their record, you need to look at each conviction on a case-by-case basis to determine whether it really impacts their ability to be a good tenant. You should be looking at, the nature of the criminal history and the time that's passed. And, whether, this, in considering that information, whether this conviction would really, impact their ability to be a good tenant. Whether it could impact somebody's health and safety of other people in the building or the property. For example, if an applicant has a recent conviction for burning down a home, then this would likely be direct related, and the housing provider would probably have a good argument that excluding somebody with a recent conviction for burning down a home would be lawful. So now we're going to briefly touch on harassment in housing. California's fair housing laws actually prohibit housing providers, including their employees, and even other tenants from harassing tenants, residents, people looking for housing based on protected characteristics. So let's talk about some examples. A housing provider says, hey, I'm going to evict you unless you go on a date with me. That would be unlawful harassment. It could be based on gender, it could be based on other types of protected characteristics. A tenant tells another tenant, hey, I am going to report you to immigration authorities because I know you're undocumented unless you let me use your parking space. Or another tenant says to another tenant, racial slurs or, makes fun of them because of their disability. That could also be unlawful harassment based on protected characteristics. And housing providers have a duty to end harassment, not only by the housing provider and their employees, but also by other tenants, especially if they have the power to do so in the lease. But also, most leases do have what's called a covenant of quiet enjoyment that the housing provider is going to do their best to provide an environment where somebody is not being harassed or that something's not happening that is in the housing provider's control that's getting in the way of them using housing. Okay, we're going to end here. I just wanted to provide you with some resources to get more information on what I talked about today. Every single topic that I talked about today could be its own 1 or 2 hour webinar, and we only really just scratched the surface. So for more information, you can go to these resources. Also, we have a portal on our website where if you are looking for housing and you see ads that are discriminatory, say they say no Section 8, no felonies, you can go to the link on this slide that says report discriminatory ads here, and you can report those ads. And I want to thank you for your attention today. Here is our contact information at the California Civil Rights Department and the information you need to file a complaint with us. Thank you so much.